Hello, I'm Ryan Cook, and this is Civic Tech Chat, a show that looks at the way technology, politics, and policy impacts the world around us, the tools we use, the way services are delivered, and how we talk about and set policy all shape our society. We'll gather around and have a chat about these things together and more. Before we get started, I do want to let you all know that we've started a Discord for the podcast. There will be a link with an invite down in the episode description. Do feel free to go check that out. It's a small community right now, but hoping to grow it. It's a great way to reach out to me and let me know things that you might want us to cover, or to just hang out and talk about civic tech. Anyway, let's go ahead and start the show. Greg, thank you so much for joining us here on Civic Tech Chat. Could you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you do?
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for having me on here. I've been a fan of Civic Tech Chat for a while, and so it's great to be, I guess, on the other side of the audio. So I'm Greg. I live in Washington, D.C., here in the U.S., and I currently work as a consultant in civic tech, I guess you could say. I'm consulting for NAVA. It's a public benefit corporation, also based here in D.C., and over the years, I guess I've worked in a bunch of different types of roles. Once upon a time, early in my career, I was doing a lot of data analysis work and GIS mapping and sort of geospatial analysis, as well as design, graphic design. And then from there, I kind of continued some of that stuff, but also got into more like web design and development. And then from there, like all sorts of, policy. So I was working at an organization, the Sunlight Foundation, that was helping city governments around the U.S. pass open data policies. So I ended up doing policy work as well as kind of program management type work. And then from there, all sorts of different things. Other stuff focused on helping local governments better use data to improve service delivery. I was doing some international work, working on the Latin American expansion of a program in that realm. I also worked at Code for America most recently on a program focused on spreading Code for America's principles and practices to governments around the country. So lots of different types of things. One other quick thing I wanted to say is that I've been involved in volunteer civic tech for a number of years. Back in, I think it was 2015, I first got involved in the Code for America Brigade in Rhode Island, which was called Code Island. Everyone seems to like the name. And then when I moved to DC, I got involved in Code for DC, and then, later ended up running it for a few years. So lots of that. And I recently started a Substack that I can tell you about later.
Absolutely. And folks may or may not know, but this appearance is been a long time coming. I've been trying to get Greg to come on the program, so I'm quite excited we get to have this conversation. And getting into that, Greg, what would you say is your personal why? A thing that drives you to get out of bed each morning and do what you do?
Yeah, I think, so I know it's very cliche to say making the world a better place, but I do like making the world a better place. And I guess specifically, like, the kind of way that I think about it is making the world a better place at a systems scale. And what I mean by that is, like, so my old dream, I don't know if I ever told you this, my old dream was to be an urban transportation planner. And I'm still very interested in urban transportation planning. But what that has in common with civic tech, or, a lot of the stuff in the space that I work in now and that you work in now, is this kind of system scale of things in which, like, if you imagine, let's say you've got a teacher, right? That's really important work. That is like a very different style of work. So that's very like one-on-one or, one-on group type work. And I think that is really incredible and really valuable work. So like a teacher, social worker, paramedic, all those sorts of things. I personally, it's not my number one interest, so I'm very glad that there are many other people who are interested in it. But I guess where my head kind of jumps to is these kinds of questions of, what does this look like at a bigger scale? And so, like, with transportation, the I've always been interested in that kind of system scale of things, of like how are, entire public transit systems operating, or, entire street, networks of streets at a city scale, or, I don't know, airline networks, things like that. And then obviously, you've got the systems part, and then you have the really important role played by everyone along the way who is doing a lot of that, some of the more sort of individual scale things. And so in this kind of realm, civic tech, gov tech, other stuff like that, I think a lot about, about the types of public services that, all sorts of different types of public services, like how are they operating at a system scale, and how are things such as the design of different services and operations and forms and workflows and processes and all sorts of other things, like how are those things impacting service delivery, and what might be able to do to improve that and serve a lot of people.
When we met before this interview, we had these meetings to kind of converse and prepare for what we might talk about. When we did that, you brought up that there are organizations in our space that can have very different levels of resourcing, whether we're talking about funding or even just the amount of folks that are available for a team. Is this this is something that I imagine can limit one's ability to implement kind of those best practices in civic tech that I think we've talked about amongst a plethora of episodes on the podcast. Is that kind of limitation something you've seen folks bump up against in your journey so far?
Yeah, I would say so. And I think one really interesting thing here is when we look at kind of the examples of things that often get shared in our space, like when people write case studies about things, or, they give inspiring presentations and all these other things, a lot of times it's about the stuff, it's about the stuff that was successful, right? You don't hear as much about the failures, even though that's like a big part of a lot of things. But B, a lot of the things you hear about the most are kind of from some of the bigger government programs and like big, larger governments and government agencies and teams. And so, like, for example, I know one time I kind of created and taught a workshop for, it was basically about an introduction to principles of human-centered design and agile development. And one of the pieces of feedback that I got afterward for the government team that I presented it to was like, they were like, the workshop was great, et cetera, et cetera. But like one thing is that the examples that were shown in the workshop were from things like, SNAP benefits in California, right? So like a major government program in the biggest state in the country, right? Like things, or other examples where it's like there were giant teams of people, maybe dozens of people working on something. We have, look, we've got all these different researchers and all these different designers and all these different, everything else. And, they were like, that stuff is great. Like it really is, and it's inspiring, but it can be hard to kind of connect the dots for us, where some of these, for a lot of the things they're working on, it might be like there's only one employee who's doing this, or like two employees. And so we need examples that are relevant to our scale of things, where we don't have a giant team of people that we can throw at stuff. And I don't think we do a good enough job today of providing those sorts of examples and like resources for people in these kinds of situations.
Now, a lot of those practices, I think, have a sort of like crux of like some benefit that they're really trying to get you to get to. And maybe the path to them is where it can either be resource intensive or less so. How can folks get at that value while still living in that constrained space we've been talking about?
Yeah, I think there are a few different ways. And actually, there are a few examples that come to mind for me. One is that one time I was, back when I was working with lots of different city governments around the country, a colleague and I were working with a major Midwestern U.S. city that we had been working on a project with one of the offices in the city government that was going to be teaching them basically human-centered design methods and improving certain things that office created. And I think something we realized a few weeks into the engagement was like, they were operating with a pretty small staff. The office only a couple people. Like we basically had just one or two main points of contact for this project, which, to be fair, like had been the case on many other projects in other cities too. But I think, having had all that benefit of past experience, we were, I think by that point, had really kind of realized that like a lot of times if you kind of take a government that's starting from a very basic place and throw kind of too much stuff at once, it's not necessarily going to stick. And so when we were working on this, like I remember when we got to the point where we were going to do some usability testing, we had thought about, we're going to set up this big complicated thing and, trackers for all these different people. And, when we write up the notes from the sessions, we're going to make a big Airtable, and that's, there's going to be this big, like, super organized thing. And it's like, come on now. Like, they don't have they're not about to go and do usability testing with like 40 people. They don't have anywhere remotely close to the resources for doing that. And honestly, it's not even necessary for the specific thing that they were doing that doesn't have that wide of a range of types of users who are using it. And so, or at least as far as they knew. And so we kind of took a step back and we were like, let's do something more basic and like try to actually like do a really good job of showing how to do this and like at a level where it will be able to stick. And so like for our usability testing, like during our engagement, we just did it with 3 people, right? And after those 3 people, we did a synthesis session. And again, there was no big Airtable or any of that stuff. We kind of just sat down and looked at our notes from those 3 sessions and said, like, what are the things that stood out? And even from those 3 people, there were already like clear usability issues with the site that we had people testing. And so like, we were very clear, like this is a lightweight version. Like yes, there's a lot more you could do if you have more time and more people, but you can still do things even under a set of resource constraints. And so, and I think we were somewhat successful. I mean, the person who was working on that project, or who had been our main point of contact, was able to like get their job changed to be like explicitly focused on human-centered design, which is great. Like I thought that was a very exciting win. Just like starting at a basic level and being clear that like basic isn't bad. Like a step forward is a step forward. Like there's a lot you can do just introducing some like really basic techniques of, whether it's different types of user research or usability testing or different design stuff or whatever it is that you're working on. Another example that comes to mind is from the DC government, where a number of years ago at Code for DC, actually, we had someone come in whose name was Carissa. She is wonderful. And she was working on a project inside her office in the DC government to redesign certain forms. I think it was like a group of 5 forms, but it was the paper forms. And of course, here in the world of like civic tech, gov tech, whatever, we're usually, when we talk about forms, we're usually talking about digital forms, or at least if we're talking about paper forms, it's usually like, how do we digitize this form, right? And the premise for this project was like, they're not there yet, like, yeah, of course they all recognize, like, yeah, woohoo, like, digital forms are great, like, having people be able to submit the stuff online is great, and like, they would like to get there someday, but they would also like to improve the forms that they have here now today, and there's an opportunity to do so. And I first just really want to appreciate them for pointing that out, because it's so true, and pointing it out and acting on it. And so Carissa came with, I think it was 5 forms that they were looking to redesign. And I believe there were also like draft new ones that they were looking for feedback on. And I remember I was looking at them and like, I thought the whole thing was cool, but I was still trying to think of like suggestions. And I was like, what, let me like create my own kind of like demonstration one that's like, if I were to make some more suggestions on top of some of the changes that have already been made to one of these, what might it look like? And so I opened up Adobe InDesign, because, design and all that stuff. And I was really excited. And I remember she was like, we can't do, like, these forms are going to have to be, like, maintainable in Microsoft Word. Like, this is not, InDesign, like, that's great, but that's not, that's not what is going to work here. Which my very first reaction was like, oh, dang it. Like, I was hoping to make, a really nice form, right? But then my second reaction was like, that's fine. Honestly, it was a little liberating, because it was like, you could forget about like some of the really like fancy fine tuning that you can do in InDesign and really just focus on the fundamentals of how to make the form more usable. And like, you can do a lot with Microsoft Word. And And so, yeah, so it's like here we have this thing where it's like, we're not there yet on digital forms. We're just trying to improve the paper ones, and like improve the paper ones on Microsoft Word. And I know that may sound like a disappointing project for a lot of folks, but like that is a huge step forward compared to the status quo in many cases. And they've had several more rounds of this. They've had events called Formapalooza, I think a few times, where they got, let's say 100 or so people together, like from the DC, community, the public, invited people and spent a day looking at forms and like picking through forms and critiquing the forms and talking to people from the government agencies that worked on these forms. And it was a super interesting event because like I remember we were at one of these, we were looking at the school enrollment form or something like that, and it was like a really hard nut to crack because it's like I think everyone could tell that like the status quo form was not great. But with all of the different kind of improvements that you might propose, like, people would ask, what about this? What about this? And then the staff would say like, yeah, like, we looked at that, like we've thought about that, but it then runs into this other problem, or like this thing runs into this other problem. And so like, I don't know, this stuff is really hard, and like literally any progress you can make with it can be a huge thing. I guess one more thing, it's not so much a specific example, but I guess just a general observation. I remember a few years ago, I heard someone saying, and I think this is so true, that they see this kind of split in like abilities where it's like, I think sometimes it can seem like things have progressed a lot in terms of, government technology and civic tech over, let's say, the past decade or so. And it is true that there are certain governments that have had a lot of progress, but there are a lot of other governments that have not. And so I think there's some things that may feel like old news to some folks, but like, this stuff is very much not old news in a lot of the governments around the country. And so, like there are just so many things that may seem basic that can actually make a big difference. Flipping this into the other direction, I think sometimes these resource constrained environments have a lot to teach us. One example that comes to mind is so for different social programs, there are a lot of states that will administer those through the state government. There are some where the state government kind of does the high level, but then gives it to the counties to administer. And I remember having a conversation with one state about their some of their forms for different social programs, because that state had worked on an integrated benefits project where you try to get different benefits programs, imagine like Medicaid, I don't know, various other social safety net programs. Instead of having people fill out many different applications where they're putting a lot of the same information, it's where you try to get one application that lets people kind of check off, I want to apply for this, this, and this, and then they can put in their info, and then it goes off to those different government agencies. So this, I was asking the state about like, how does that work when it gets to the county level? And they're saying like, well, it's like, they have departments that do this, and they'll have different branches within that look at, this person's eligibility for this program versus this program versus this program, right? At least in some of the larger counties. In some of the smaller counties, they have people who, because the county is much smaller in population and the department is much smaller, these people are looking across multiple programs, right? Like one person may be processing someone's eligibility for multiple programs, which is not necessarily what you see in some of those bigger counties. And so the cool thing there is that those people in the smaller county governments that we might think of as being constrained are actually like experts on kind of the similarities and differences between the different programs and like the different eligibility, rules and requirements, and where things overlap and where they don't. Like some of those people were experts in ways that, in some of the bigger counties where people were kind of, where the caseworkers are more sectioned off into different programs, some of those folks did not have as much insight or visibility across different programs. So there's an opportunity to learn from smaller governments and smaller agencies, in cases like this where they're able to, where they have individual people who are working on a wider range of things and can see some of those connections that sometimes get missed.
A couple of themes I heard there I think are interesting tie-ins for the next question we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
One of those is, I remember you said the statement, simple isn't bad. which resonates with me because I think a thing I've observed is a commonality between technology systems and administrative systems is often a desire to want to hop to something that scales. And often that means like heaping complexity on, even if it's not necessarily going to be the thing that actually is durable for more operations or for a bigger team. Similarly, you mentioned that anecdote about using Microsoft Word, which has very meet folks where they are kind of vibes to me. And I think those two examples kind of go well together. But keeping those in mind, as well as thinking about other things, are there practices you would recommend folks either go to or try to avoid as they're thinking about how to get this value in their own environment?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think that there are, I guess, a few things. I mean, I guess you already said some of those things, but definitely like encouraging people to not jump to complexity is a big one. And yeah, like you said, meeting people where they are, like the Microsoft Word example, like focusing on what incremental improvements can you make. A big one, so an interesting one I've actually heard from government folks in different governments is where they kind of started out with high hopes and then ended up, I've heard several different people who've ended up like asking people in every department, how do you use a computer, if you use a computer at all? And I know one person from one mid-sized city said that she talked to certain like department heads, like people up pretty high, whose answer was, I do not use a computer, which is like kind of shocking, but like, it's good to know. Like I remember talking to someone else who thought that his job was going to be working on open data, but then it turned out like a lot of the city's data was just so awful that like it turned into like improving data entry, like working with department staff and like seeing how certain data is getting entered into computer systems in the first way and trying to get that cleaned up. Which, it may not be the sexiest thing in the world, but like this stuff really matters. So anyway, but yeah, getting a sense of really where are things at right now. And like, I think many times you'll discover pretty quickly that there are opportunities to do a lot of good starting at like a really basic level. Pursuing some of those rather than jumping to, bigger or potentially more exciting things can be an opportunity to do a lot of good. So I think that's one. Then another is like usability testing, particular, and like user research are things where like they're obviously that's like, it's a whole entire profession. There are people who dedicate, all day, every day, when they go to work to doing that. But like there are still techniques that like people, who don't have that as their job can learn. Like you can learn how to do usability testing. You can learn how to do user research, how to do different kinds of interviews, how to ask the right questions, how to take notes, and other things, right? And you don't have to be the world's #1 expert to still be able to get a lot of really valuable insights, for your team. And so maybe you're someone who's officially a program analyst or, I don't know, a million different job titles, project manager, whatever, right? But there are opportunities for you, especially in the world of user research, and to get into some of this stuff. And again, like for a lot of things, that is just not part of the way things are. And to be fair, like this isn't a criticism of the public sector. Like you can find plenty of businesses who like don't adequately test stuff with their customers. But yeah, so helping like regular government staff, upskilling them on user research in particular, I think is like a great way to pay big dividends, even in resource constrained environments.
I think one key takeaway from that is that if I can grok some user research concepts, then anybody can. So yeah, I would certainly encourage folks to go and get that at least the shallow portion of that knowledge. I think it helps with so many different disciplines.
Yeah, and especially like something that can help galvanize support, and like especially from the top level, is if you are able to do, like if you can get people at the top of your organization, department heads or whoever, depending on the size of your organization, if you can get them to join some user research or interview sessions or usability testing sessions, that can be like a really big eye-opening moment. Even just watching it one time. Like one time this wasn't even necessarily department heads, but one time I was running a workshop for people, and I had an activity there that was teaching them about usability testing, and I had them look at I basically had them pretend that they were a new resident in a certain town in Massachusetts. And my task that I had for them was figure out when is trash day. Which seems like maybe it ought to be really simple. But they got going, and so I was teaching them how to do it. So I had people in, I think, groups of 3, whereas like one person was guiding it, one person was taking notes, and then one person was the actual one trying to figure this out. And people learned some about how to do usability testing. Also, they had a huge aha moment because it was really hard to figure out. In fact, some of the groups that were going through this task literally couldn't figure out on the city's website what day was trash day. And they gave up and said, I would just look across the street and like look at which day my neighbors put out their trash cans, and that's how I would figure out what day is trash day. I think that's how hard it was, which really made them think like, wow, that like this, and then you start wondering, like, do some of my own websites have these problems? Yeah, I think bringing people at the top in to like get a peek at some of this stuff can also be a big thing.
In our conversations, you've also brought up the idea of digital services practices applying to spaces beyond, the digitized form. In particular, you mentioned operations. How would you describe that interaction for folks listening?
Yeah. So the way that I think about this is like, I was thinking about this a few years ago, actually, at I was at a conference and I saw, all these talks and whatnot. And I kind of noticed, I was like, when people talked about government services, it seemed like most people were talking about it like services are just forms. It's like they're just transactions, right? Government services are just where you apply for things and then you get money, or you apply for things and you get permission for something, or you apply for something and some action is taken or not, right? And that's of course like a lot of really important government services fall in that category. Also, a lot of other really important government services do not fall in that category. Think of everything from like schools, education, to parks, to airport security, to, health services, to all sorts of different things. Some of them will have transactions kind of on the fringes, right? Like for accessing it, or finding out information about it, or, dealing with stuff like that. But like the bulk of the service is actually just delivered by human beings or by physical infrastructure, right? So like if you, like for public transportation, for example, like sure, there are, you need to, if you're riding a system for the first time, you might need to buy a fare card or ticket or something like that, right? You may need to look at a schedule, right? But that's not the service. The service is the actual transportation, right? So like find out like where's my bus in real time, right? That's not the service. The service is the bus. Just to be clear, right? And so, and you could say the same thing about parks or public hospitals or whatever else. And so, and I think sometimes the operation side of things has been neglected a bit, at least in a lot of, again, just in the kind of civic tech and gov stuff that I see mentioned. But I do think this is changing, which is very exciting, because there are opportunities to have really big impact at scale. And actually kind of tying it back to what I was saying at the beginning when you're asking me, like, what's my personal why and what kind of drives me? And I was talking about how I, like systems scale. I like kind of looking at things at a system scale. And for the transportation example, so one of my favorite digital services teams in the US is in Boston at the transit agency, the MBTA. And they have a department there. It used to be called the Customer Technology Department. Now I think it's like the Technology Innovation Department or something. But the name aside, they work on a lot of different projects, basically. And some of them are public facing. So they worked on the agency's website, other stuff like that. But some of them are not public facing. Some of them are exclusively internal. And so they have a pair of projects focused on improving operations of services. So they have one for bus services and then one for some of their rail services. And so to use the bus one as an example, they have, so you have bus drivers, right? Driving the buses. There are also other personnel out in the field who work with kind of the management of bus operations in the moment. And so they created this app for iPads that these personnel were going to carry with them to help them in their jobs of managing bus service in real time. Because previously what those people would be doing is they would have like giant paper schedules and, you know, be writing all sorts of stuff out on paper. And then they would have radios where they're like calling up, you know, bus drivers saying, hey, like, where are you? Or, like, you know, whatever. And so what this thing did was it brought all of this onto a digital interface. It let them kind of, you know, enter information in there, see where the buses are in real time, you know, all sorts of stuff like that, which in turn helps them be much, you know, do a better job at managing bus service, which is huge because the buses there, I think, have like hundreds of thousands of daily passengers. So like you're having a real impact on a lot of people, even though this is an app that the public will never see. But I think that's huge. And they do, again, like all the kind of practice that we talk about, like they do user research out there in the field with these personnel, and a lot of really cool stuff. I've seen them give presentations at a number of conferences, and I never get tired of it because they're really awesome.
I think some of this was in your anecdote, but I'd be kind of curious to hear your take on, you know, when a team gets involved in one of those kind of operations projects and does it well, what are what does that look like? What are kind of the tenets that look like success?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest ways that, you know, it's successful is when people start asking for more. You know, because with these kinds of things, it can be really tricky because a lot of times people hear your idea and they might think, oh yeah, I mean, first of all, some people just, it's not on the radar screen as like, I don't know, they may not see the status quo as a problem, right? They may be so used to it, they may not realize that there's a better way of doing things. I think there's that quote that's like, you know, if you ask someone with a horse what they wanted, they'd say a faster horse. They wouldn't have said a car, right? Or like, you know, whatever, right? And so, you know, so people don't always even realize what these opportunities might be. But when they do, or like, you know, if you tell them about your idea, a lot of times people's reaction is like, that sounds great, but I'm afraid that like this, you know, I'm going to have to like learn a whole new tool for my job. Like I remember the last time they tried to make us use a new tool and that was such a pain and it was so difficult to use and everyone hated it and they wouldn't listen to us and, you know, all that stuff. So like people may have bad memories of, you know, having had different kinds of tools or technologies forced upon them. And so, so there's oftentimes going to be a lot of skepticism. Also, like sometimes people are afraid that this new tool is going to, you know, eliminate their job, which is, you know, a totally understandable concern. And so I think when you're really, you know, I think you're asking like, what's an indicator that you've done things well? Like if people are like, if you've gone through this and people say, great, like, can we get more of this? You know, or like, could you be using this? Can we do this for more things? I think that's how you know that you've really secured the buy-in of people in your organization, which is huge because that can be really hard.
And let's say I am one of those folks that's trying to secure buy-in, trying to operate in this environment today. What advice would you give me sitting in that chair on how I can kind of engage with that work and get that buy-in, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big one is talking to people, you know, who work in these jobs. That's part of the whole idea here, right? Like doing user research and usability testing with them. And like making it clear that you are trying to help them in their jobs. Because a lot of times they, you know, I was saying how they've had different tools and technologies forced upon them. You know, in many cases, they were never consulted on this stuff, right? It may have been someone at the way top of the department, or even maybe someone in the procurement office or whoever that was making really critical decisions about this thing that people were going to have to use every day without necessarily getting much input or feedback from the people on the front lines. And so, like bringing them into this and like making it clear that the point is to help them and that like the central guiding light in making it happen is going to be their feedback and like testing it with them and seeing if it works or not, and how it can improve in their experience, right? Centering their experience, I think is a key way to help get that buy-in. And also, like, another thing can be making stuff optional. So I think one thing, I don't quote me on this, but I believe the team on the project I was working, the tool that I was talking about, I think or at least at first it was optional. So it was like, we have this thing that you can opt into if you want. And I think it ended up being so successful that more and more people started saying, oh yes, like I choose this. It might be mandatory now, I'm not sure. But even if it is mandatory now, it's mandatory after having secured a ton of people's buy-in along the way.
Oh, and don't worry, I'll have a quote from this right after recording on all my socials ready to go.
Nice.
To send out there. But I think something that I'm hearing there is that you're describing kind of that effective change management tactic where if you invite somebody in to contribute to a change, they're naturally going to buy in because they're a contributor to it. They're part of the decision. When you're part of the decision, you naturally like want it to succeed. Am I kind of hearing you correctly that that's like a key portion?
Exactly. And the other piece of advice I would give is like, that you might not get their buy-in. Like, this is really hard, and like sometimes it's not going to be successful, and like I guess you should you should know from the start that like not everything is going to be rainbows and unicorns, and there might be some things where you encounter so much resistance that it's worth just shifting your effort elsewhere. If you're, let's say, an internal government team, sometimes you should also just go where people are more willing to work with you.
As we prepared for this, we also talked about the difficulties that can come with mismatched language or terminology. Why is this a problem worth digging into?
Yeah, I mean, actually, this relates to the thing I was just talking about, but yeah, like something I've seen, or just, on this question of change management, I think something that I've heard from so many folks in so many governments around the country is they feel like there's this disconnect between the way that people, especially people who kind of identify as being part of civic tech, the way that some of these people talk and the way that a lot of other folks in government talk. That I've had so many people say to me, like, I feel like people are talking two different languages. And sometimes it's because people have different approaches to things. Sometimes it's because they may actually be talking about the same thing, but just literally using different words. And so sometimes it's just a question of like, can you get people to understand that they're talking about the same thing in different words? Can be big. And sometimes that means accepting the words that are already being used, internally. So like something I hear a lot is like IT departments, like will often talk about things in a certain way. It might not be the most like 2024 way of talking about certain things. Or the most whatever, the most designy way or whatever, right? But that is perfectly good for like, what needs to happen. And so like sometimes you need to like just go to people and speak in their language, like learn the terms that people are already using and learn to speak in those terms, I think is big. So like one, I don't want to get into too much trouble here, but I think one example that comes to mind to me is the word digital. I remember one time I saw someone kind of posing the question to other folks in the civic tech community, like, how do I get folks in government, or like I'm working with the government, how do I get them to understand that the word digital isn't about technology? And the answer and that's, under this like, like a very niche definition of the word digital that I like perfectly respect, that it's, about processes and culture and this other stuff, not just the literal technology. And I think that's like a great approach and mindset. However, just on this question of terminology, like to this person's question, I think the answer is that you don't. Like you like, how do you get people to understand that like their definition of a word is wrong? It just like you don't just like talk to them in language that already makes sense. Like understand and accept that the word digital for most people is about technology and it's only about technology, and just like learn to work around that. Use if you want to talk about other stuff, use their stuff. At least until maybe someone starts using digital with you in this expanded way. But if that's not the way that they're talking, don't try to like make them feel stupid for not talking that way. That's one example. Another would be like, I remember someone from a major U.S. city government in the South telling me that he, like, his old department or his old group team, whatever, was kind of like this innovation team inside that city's government. And they were seen as kind of like the weird people with all the colorful Post-it notes on the wall. And then he was saying how there was a different office that was like a performance management and analytics office. And they were seen by people at the top of the city government as like the very serious people who were all about like results and cost savings and getting things done. And I think that like the thing here, it's like, if you, let's say you're over in the office that's seen as the colorful Post-it notes on the wall office, right? Like if you are not being seen as serious about getting stuff done, like that's a problem, you know? And also like, that's not an attitude that you should make fun of, right? Like getting stuff done is good. Getting results is good. Getting cost savings is good. Like we save money for a reason so that we can then invest it into other programs or pay people more, lower tax rates, you know, however you want to spend the money, right? Like efficiency is good. And I don't think people should be afraid to talk about efficiency in government being good, you know? And so, you know, I think just learning to talk about the things that you're trying to achieve in a way that matches how other people talk about that, or at least can kind of narrow this gap, I think is important. Because I think sometimes people, depending on the background they're coming from, you know, they might talk in this very kind of like abstract, you know, designy way, whatever, that's like totally well-intentioned, right? And like I think the whole like people-centered focus of stuff is good, right? But like the people who talk about efficiency and cost savings results, like they also care about people. Like that's what they're trying to do too. So I think, just like kind of trying to close this gap in language and like bring people together and help people see that they are marching toward the same place, and trying to get cultures to kind of these different kinds of work styles and cultures to sort of melt together, I think can be key to unlocking a lot of like productive collaborative work.
Your anecdotes make me think of an idea that I think leads us to what the next question will be, which is that, for example, the story you mentioned about the word digital, right? So one could spend a bunch of time on trying to make sure that had a consistent definition with whoever you're partnering with, right? Even if the majority of those folks don't have that idea already. But one way to think about that is that's a lot of energy you're spending on arguably like a semantics thing that you could be spending on those processes and procedures, that kind of good stuff that you were hoping to get from the use of the word digital that maybe isn't there yet, or some of it is, that like proper advocacy. So as folks kind of get into those situations or they're running against those differences in terms, what they really want is that value stuff that's like after you get past that. What kind of advice would you give them as they're kind of facing that down and trying to figure out how to take their next step?
So I guess this is like after people have already bridged gaps in terminology and language.
Oh, actually, maybe like right at that moment where they're trying. So imagine like, you know, you start with a new government partner, with an NGO, something like that, and you've had your meetings, and as you go through, or even just writing a proposal, like as you kind of go through and you're just finding that you say milestone, they mean release. You know, you say continuous integration, they mean continuous deployment. I'm sure there's plenty of other terms.
I heard one once that was like, someone was saying like, our IT department says user acceptance testing. Like, for our purposes, like, is that the same as usability testing? Is it not? Could it be close enough? Like, can we talk about our stuff in that way? Anyway, that's just another example.
Yeah, so as someone's kind of like getting into that early stage of like, man, how do I even start to tackle this? What kind of advice would you give them?
Talk to people. Definitely talk to people. Like read their stuff. That's a good place to start. Read about the people who you're hoping to work with, read about the stuff that they work on, see if you can read about the terms that they use for their work, so that when you go in to talk with them, you can like talk to them about, like, you can show that you've done your homework, you know, and that you have that you have spent the time to try to get an understanding of their work. And obviously by talking to them, you're trying to get a deeper understanding, I think is one. And like clarifying terminology, so like just asking, like, when you say this term, like, what do you mean by that? You know, it's another one. And I think one way you can kind of do your homework on some of that terminology stuff is, especially if there is any documentation about existing kind of processes or workflows or ways of doing things, that can be a good place to see a lot of different terminology in one place. Granted, in some places the state of documentation is not where one wishes it might be. Honestly, I feel like in any organization it's usually not where everyone might wish it is. But I think building something else that can really help is just like building informal connections with people. So like if you can meet people at an event, or like over lunch, or like something like that, where it's not just a high stakes, businessy meeting, that can be an opportunity to like build a good relationship with people first, and then from there dig into the more like work stuff, which can create a foundation of like mutual understanding and respect. And even, just throwing in the fun stuff, asking people about, I don't know, their favorite ice cream flavor or whatever, even, the cheesy icebreakers even, can be a great thing. But yeah, I think really just trying to do your homework and show people that you've done your homework, and like listen and just ask questions and listen before coming in with answers is can be big. And actually, sorry, one other funny anecdote about the language stuff. I remember one time I was in a meeting in a city government in the Western US, and there was this guy who was kind of like a innovation fellow type person working in one of the central offices in the city government. And I remember we had this meeting where everyone went around and introduced themselves, and the icebreaker that I had everyone answer, I like this one, is like, what's your favorite department, like inside your government, your favorite like department, service, whatever, something like that. And different people name the different ones. People be like, I like Parks and Rec, or public health, or there's always the person who says, I love payroll, that's my favorite one. Keep the checks coming. But when we get to this guy, he's like, I really don't like the word department, because I think it encourages us to think in like a siloed mentality, and we should really be taking like a service-centered perspective where we look across departments, yada yada yada. And the thing was, like, I totally agree philosophically, right? But in practice, it's like, oh my god, it's a freaking icebreaker question. Can you just like be a normal person and not want to like smash the terminology, like stuff like that. Like, don't do stuff like that. One other really funny example is I know someone from one team in a particular government who he said that like they when they work with some of their staff who are more kind of on the front lines, that they like this, some of the people who work for this team is they're people with a design background, or tech, whatever, things like that. And some of the frontline staff, when they encounter these people, he said they're like, this is just too much skinny jeans stuff for me. So again, like trying to not come off as like the skinny jeans people can be helpful.
As we get to our ending section here, Greg, I did have 2 more questions for you.
Mm-hmm.
First one is, considering everything we've talked about so far today, what's one thing you'd like listeners to take away from that chat?
One thing, that's hard. I think a big thing is just like, there is so much opportunity to improve things in government, or in lots of nonprofits and businesses as well, at the basic end of things. Or like, you know, if you've been kind of deep in some of the stuff for a long time, there's stuff that may seem really basic to you, but like if put into practice, like in a lot of places, that would literally be revolutionary, you know, or like could make so much difference in helping people. And so I think just kind of focusing, really just trying to focus on a lot of the low-hanging fruit, and also like, I mean, there's things you may not even realize is low-hanging fruit because you just kind of assume that, you know, whatever, I don't know. And so really just looking for opportunities to connect with people at a very basic level, you know, what I said about the terminology and whatnot, like just like being able to communicate with people, create shared understanding, like do just little bits of user research, like even just like a bit of iteration, you know, and improvement based on research and testing things with people. Like, yeah, just even just a little dose of that can do a lot in improving service delivery. And, you know, you don't need to have a giant team with dozens of people to have an impact.
Now that we're at the end of the episode, I imagine folks are starting to think about, man, what am I going to listen to next, or read next, or watch next? So are there any videos, books, podcasts, or other media that you would recommend to the folks out there listening right now?
There are. Gosh, so many different types of materials. In terms of books, I would say, well, okay, so Jen Pahlka, who is amazing. Jen Pahlka has a book called Recoding America. If you are in my the type of person who is on my LinkedIn feed, right? Like this, I mean, you know, kind of in our little niche here. Obviously, the book is pretty well known at this point, but you know, it's making the rounds. And has been doing so for the past year. But it's really is good. And especially, I think, for people who are not in this space, it is kind of like a big, you know, wow. Like, you just read some of the stuff, and a lot of people read about this stuff, and it's the first time they're reading about, like, problems with procurement, or, like, problems with, you know, whatever, different, you know, reporting systems, or whatever else, you name it. And so... So it's a great book. And actually, I mean, she has an essay called Delivery Driven Policy. And even just like reading that is really good. So that's one. Another book, is a book called The Fifth Risk, which is a good book about like, I don't even know how to describe it. It's like all sorts of different things that go on inside government that you never really knew about or appreciated, but have an impact on your life. And it was looking at, in particular, the kind of government transition in 2016 and 2017 and some of the kind of messes that there were there. And another, this is not related to government or technology or civic anything, but podcasts. There's a great podcast called The Mindset Mentor. And it's literally like mindset types, you know, like how to think positively, like how to structure your day, how to like ways to be successful at X, like ways to stop worrying about ABC, right? Like stuff that just, it's really basic life stuff, but you look at they have like 4.9 stars or something, and like it's really good, and it's like advice that's like, a lot of it's cliche, but it's cliche for a reason. Like it's like, if everyone followed this advice, the world would be a different place. And like also, it's just hard to change lots of, you know, life habits and whatnot. So it's, I just find the podcast very inspiring, to be honest, like, and like it's, yeah, it's just, so that's cool. And then a blog, really one of my favorite blogs is Slow Boring by Matt Iglesias. I think if you like politics blogs, I think it's really good. And speaking of blogs, I started a Substack. If you're not familiar with Substack, it's a blog / email newsletter rolled into one that is, so mine is called Civic Insider, like Insight-er. CIVICINSIGHTER.com. Go check it out. And I write about a lot of different topics. I mean, you know, some things kind of like some of the things we talked about here. I've had some recent ones related to public policy, education, service design, different visual design things, different procurement. I mean, all different things in kind of like the public sphere. And there's a further wide range of things that I have in the pipeline. I also am planning interviews with people. So if you like Civic Tech Chat, also like hopefully you'll like my upcoming interviews with different people. So definitely check out my Substack. And yeah, I don't know. There's probably a million other things too.
Awesome. I was wondering when the call to action was going to come.
I'm
glad we managed to fit it in.
You got to rack up the subscribers.
Oh, absolutely. And I will tell folks that if you're one of those folks that listens to this podcast, you're probably someone who would be interested in what Greg's written about, particularly if you enjoy that kind of like cross-discipline thinking about this kind of bubble space that we're in around trying to do things that help government services be effective and more. But I would definitely check that out. And worry not, all that those mediums and things that Greg mentioned will be in links in the episode description when you're glancing at this in your device of choice. But Greg, thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast. I'm glad we could finally get this one to happen.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's great to be on here.
You can follow us on Twitter using the handle @CivicTechChat, visit us on the web at civictech.chat, or subscribe to us for content updates wherever it is you download your podcasts.